As I said about the fragmentation, if we don't solve this bottleneck, each part of the step will require its own new, fresh ID kind of presentation. So imagine those 10 different steps in a transaction. Every single one of those, you've got to represent an identification, check who you are, who they are, who you are, who they are, every single step of the process. Again, that's loads of friction. But if you start to see language about IDs becoming portable, this is really important information, portable, that means you can have your ID check at the beginning and it applies across all the different ledgers, all the different transaction types you can do, really slowing down that transaction speed and bringing compliance and identification into the money itself. The money can't move if it isn't compliant, and it can't be compliant if the IDs haven't been approved. So as soon as you start seeing IDs being portable in this new financial system, you know that compliance has been brought closer to the money. Confirmation number 4 might be a little bit scary, but this is when you start seeing banks actually restricting the certain payments for certain reasons. One of the key nuances of this is that they're treating programmable money not as kind of like a buzzword or like a fun new thing, but actually just as the way the system is. And there'll be slight linguistic changes in the way that they communicate these things that would suggest, this is actually in place, and we're not just trying to sound cool by saying programmable money. Confirmation number 5 is when these real settlement networks, like you've got DTCC or Euroclear, they would actually start announcing that they're standardizing how these controls and compliance actually work. And so you really have to be looking for frameworks for compliance and control from these entities, publishing them. They will publish them as live press releases and all that kind of stuff. They'll talk about compliance logic and permissions, identity checks, and auditability. And that's when you know it won't just be a pilot or a one-off experiment, and this is actually being embedded in the new system. So you might not know, but all of this information is actually condensed, all put together into one single kind of research brief. Research to this degree is usually only provided to these big hedge funds and banks kind of behind closed doors. And I realized this in my research, that this stuff isn't shared with the public. And one thing I noticed about their research that is never shared on a public scale are the invalidation triggers. What things can happen that show us that the thesis that we have about compliance coming in closer to money is actually incorrect and it's moving in a different direction. Ultimately, what I look for is having a high degree of confirmation and a low degree of invalidation, and that determines how heavily I move my investments around and in what assets. Now, obviously, there are lots of talks like in Project Agora, where they're basically just flirting with the idea of having these unified environments where you can transact all kind of together and settle payments, and this unified ledger kind of conversation. Invalidation number 2 would be if you had some sort of documentation published about how each individual bank will need its own compliance and control stack process individually to each institution or bank, right? So they would be handling their own compliance in their own way in a very siloed fashion. That would be an invalidation for this thesis. Invalidation number 3 is if we start to see regulators say that we are not going to be programming money. That's obviously a very clear and obvious signal, but it would invalidate this thesis. Invalidation number 4 would be if privacy concerns, the whole idea of maintaining a level of privacy, restricts compliance. This would only happen if they end up prioritizing privacy and are happy for compliance to take place in a separate location. There is actually something called the Digital Euro Scheme Rulebook, and they build the rules around this exact thing. But they really do stress the idea of having high standards for privacy and data protection. So if they end up saying that we can't enforce this programmable thing, or we can't enforce compliance without breaching data privacy, then that's a big invalidation. And the 5th invalidation is if ID never actually becomes portable. I find that really hard to imagine that they would just allow, like I said, with the transaction with 10 stops, to just have 10 different KYC checks every time. It doesn't make any sense to do that. So this is highly unlikely for it to be invalidated. But still, if it were invalidated, it would clearly show us that the thesis is in the wrong direction. The way I look at it is if you've got 3 or 4 of those positive confirmations about this thesis, you can use that information to start allocating or getting exposure to the assets that are solving the problems in that area. But if you have more invalidation than validation, you're obviously going to pay less attention to the assets that are within that bottleneck. Because if it is becoming invalidated, it means the bottleneck is actually somewhere else and not necessarily in compliance and control. So now that we've done that part, the part that most people skip, Now let's get into where the opportunities are in terms of asset exposure. And remember, the goal here is to position ourselves around the bottleneck of the problem, because the projects around the bottleneck will at some point free the bottleneck. And that's the exact type of situation where there is a mass repricing of all of the assets and the projects around that bottleneck. They immediately go to a new price. So if you want to be part of a repricing, put your hand up. I absolutely do. That's why I'm here. Now, I really want to make this very clear. What I'm about to talk about with these assets is not financial advice. I'm not telling you to buy these assets. I'm simply telling you where the projects are and the assets related to those projects around a bottleneck that we can clearly see. And that's based on a thesis that can be proven wrong or proven right over time. Nothing is certain. I just want you to know that. And that's the lovely thing about this, right? We're on a sliding scale of confidence rather than a yes, this is a good thing, or no, this is a bad thing. Because it's yes or no binary thinking that gets people into a position where they win or they lose, rather than the way the funds do it is, to what degree have we won? To what degree have we lost?